The Hidden Truth About Plastics by April Sheely. Plastics are not always equated with oil consumption. Plastics are usually thought of as a waste problem. And really, that is what plastic is. But before landfills, most plastic comes from fossil fuel waste. Yet, in a brilliant economic system of not letting anything go to waste, plastics have become one of the most lucrative uses of oil. Plastic's versatility, low cost, and light-weighted strength gives it a home everywhere, even if it is redundant and ineffective. Even when one product, such as a single-use plastic, begins to have negative connotations, plastic will pop up in other products and continue to remain in products we don't even think about. Plastics, also known as petrochemicals in the oil industry, are found in packaging, construction, textiles, electronics, transportation, even in green energy such as solar panels and wind turbines. Besides critically harming ecosystems and filling our landfills, other problems related to oil, are imminent. Emissions are a problem throughout plastic's life, especially in production. Oil creates 10 to 13% of allotted greenhouse gases that we must stay under to avoid the 1.5 degree temperature change that we all dread. And the World Economic Forum predicts plastic production will double in the next 20 years. But due to the coronavirus pandemic, we have a chance to alter these projections. The biggest problem with plastic is that it enables production of oil, even when there is no natural economic demand for it. The oil industry that mines, fracks, and pumps through pipelines is in search of a place to sell their product. Even as regulations on emissions, increased fuel efficiency, and bans on single-use plastic are creating less of a demand. Yes, emissions from creating plastics are 10 to 13% of the problem, contributing to global warming. But they are also enabling much more of that portion. If demand for plastic stopped, oil companies could not sustain themselves. To illustrate plastics production cycle, I will explain through emissions, but keep in mind these emissions are a secondary problem to the fact that production of plastics from freshly pumped oil gives the industry a place to dump wasted materials that otherwise would create such a waste problem they could not even exist. CO2 emitting starts the beginning of the chain: fossil fuel extraction and transport. In 2015, extraction and cracking for plastics emitted 9.5 to 10.5 metric tons of CO2 yearly. Globally, this number was 108 million metric tons. The second process of cracking, in 2015, extraction alone emitted 9.5 to 10.5 metric tons of CO2. The second process of cracking oil, where they separate ethylene from the methane in order to get the oil ready to create plastic. The methane goes to provide energy for homes, businesses, and vehicles, but the ethylene part of the oil cannot be used for energy in homes or vehicles because it contains too many BTUs. It is considered too wet. Without plastics, this ethylene would basically be garbage, and oil wells could not stay in business at this level, at the level they are today. The New York Times illustrates this fact by quoting Patrick Henderson, Pennsylvania's Governor Corbett's energy advisor on deciding to invite and offer $1.6 billion in tax breaks to the Shell chemical cracking plant. What became apparent to me and the governor is that there needed to be an outlet for the ethane, Henderson says, as he was referring to the shale mines in Pennsylvania. There were 24 ethylene cracking facilities in 2015 in the U.S. Now, 343 have been propositioned to both crack gas and produce plastics, and were set to break ground in 2019 and 2020. This would drastically grow the 2015 CO2 emitted 17.5 million metric tons for cracking. The Shell factory would emit almost 13% of the cracking today. Imagine 342 more of these production sites for cracking and plastic production. This points to all the excess ethylene that these pipelines and shale fracking mines are creating after the methane is stripped to go produce oil. So this ethylene stays back and is processed to make monomers in the form of styrene, vinyl chloride, acrylonitrile, and other monomers. These monomers then go on to be polymerized with plasticizers, dye, flame retardant chemicals, and become polymer resins in the form of pellets. They then are injected, blown, rotated, and extruded to make different kinds of plastic we may more conveniently know as 1 through 7 on the bottom of our consumer labeled packaging. So the polyethylene terephthalate, which is also known as PET or PET or PETE, and more widely known as polyester, is found in single-use plastics and textiles and many things in between. As you can see, that is the most popularly made and used plastic, but it is decreasing quite a bit. It is also very recyclable, however, only gets recycled about 20% of the time. Polyethylene is labeled number 2 and number 4. For the high density is our laundry detergent bottles, which are also pretty recyclable, and the low density, which make up our grocery bag plastic. On the bottom, the items labeled number 3 are PVC. These are not as recyclable. Polypropylene is number 5 and is in high demand for the use in cars, other industrial uses. Polystyrene is also known as styrofoam, and this is labeled number 6. On a consumer level, it's very unrecyclable, very non-recyclable. And polycarbonate, and along with other miscellaneous plastics, are labeled number 7, and these are mostly non-recyclable. So that's a little background on plastics. These plastics that we know most commonly as 1 through 7, according to E360, use 14% of our oil, but will drive 50% of demand for all oil into 2050. This needs to be stopped, and we have a chance to change these projections due to the coronavirus slump in oil demand. The plastic problem has largely been focused on waste. However, right here and now, we need to be asking ourselves, where does plastic come from? We know it comes from oil, and less than 10% of it comes from the United States factories. Many companies from the United States outsource the production of supplies created in other countries. But to put this into perspective, in 2015, the U.S. emitted 17.5 million metric tons of CO2 from cracking, while the world emitted 184 million metric tons. This is all positioned to change. Starting last year, while protests and bans of single-use plastic are piling high, 343 plastic production plants are set to be built in the United States using American fracked oil. These companies are mostly from other countries: South Africa, Brazil, China, Thailand, and Taiwan, to name a few. South Africa's Sasol Plastics broke ground last year in St. James Parish, Louisiana. This place has been dubbed Cancer Alley because of its pollution rate, but larger projects are still in the process of being permitted and built in Cancer Alley. This must be stopped. This is not progress and is not needed. These plants serve as a money-making machine and hold very little value to society. They serve as a dumping ground for the part of oil that otherwise cannot be utilized, ethylene. Due to large drops in fuel use, first from better fuel efficiency and policies, and now from the coronavirus pandemic, it is near impossible to warrant pumping this gas. But since the U.S. and the global economy so heavily rely on it, this is an attempt to stay afloat. Now is the time of great change. I argue there is no better time for an about-face to the economy and this neoliberalist greed. Petroleum-based plastics must ultimately be stopped, if for no other reason. The waste that it creates kills ocean wildlife and ecosystems and will fill up our waste facilities because it practically never decomposes. While recycling and reusing plastic may be a necessary stopgap measure, the fact that plastics is shed into our waterways, whether it is from recycled plastic products or new plastic products, poisoning, either way they shed into our waterways and poison our food chain, possibly harming the phytoplankton, that life on Earth, that creates most of the oxygen for life on Earth. So the idea of trying to move in the direction of completely eliminating plastic is necessary. And this is our only hope, even if it never is completely eradicated. As I have already mentioned, petroleum-based plastic is created from pipelines and oil mines and other sources, just like the gas that runs our vehicles and power plants. Oil production is known for stripping resources from the ground, hurting those that live above them, and ultimately polluting our atmosphere. Oil prices have plunged, first because of the rise in fuel efficiency, and now more dramatically due to extremely low transportation levels and lower factory output. Check out these images. I'm sure you've seen this one, and it gives me hope. This is like, I love these pictures. So, and then I also found some, this is one up in New England, in New York, and Pennsylvania, and in North Carolina and South Carolina. And this is in India. Starting in 2016, it kept getting lower due to more efficient use of products, but now, but because of the coronavirus on the bottom right, it's just amazingly clear. So, if we are to make a dent in this industry that has immense momentum and is heavily lobbied in Congress, we must kick them while they're down. As of now, many of these companies are losing stockholders in legal battles, but still they seem set on breaking ground. The largest of these facilities is Formosa Plastics that will directly take its oil from the end of the Dakota Access Pipeline's last leg, known as the Bayou Bridge Pipeline. Formosa Plastics creates materials that go into plastics labeled 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, along with other caustic chemicals such as bleach and hydrochloric acid. This Louisiana Formosa site will be one of the largest petrochemical complexes in the world, almost doubling toxic emissions in the area where it will be built. This area, St. James Parish, has been dubbed Cancer Alley because of its already high pollution rate, and yet Formosa will double this area's emission. 9.4 billion. This is a $9.4 billion facility owned by Taiwanese chemicals firm, and would consist of 14 separate plastic plants across 2,300 acres of land in St. James Parish. 13 million tons of greenhouse gases a year are what it will produce, which is over 76% of the emissions that are created from plastic making in the US today. They practically double it by that one facility, yet 343 facilities are set to be built. It will also emit many dangerous pollutants into the air. The 16 permits issued by Louisiana State Environmental Agency allow Formosa to break ground anytime. And it is expected to create 1,200 new permanent jobs and 8,000 temporary jobs. A movement called Rise believes there will not be proper oversight of this facility, and has partnered with Reverend Barber, who is known for relaunching the Martin Luther King Jr. Poor People's Campaign. This approval signals that our state government is willing to sacrifice our health, our clean air and water to cheap plastics. Rolling Stone reports. And Rolling Stone reports that according to the EPA, Formosa has violated the Clean Air Act every quarter since 2009, and the Resource Conservation Act every quarter since 2004 in its other facilities. Such it has more facilities in Texas and in Louisiana. And it is telling of Louisiana's policies because in Texas, a Formosa factory that violated the Clean Water Act lost a court battle recently and had to pay the largest amount ever to an individual for violating this act, in the amount of $50 million. It goes to show that Louisiana is not enforcing these EPA acts. Stopping the production, and this is an example, this picture here on the left is an example of what happened with the Clean Water Act, is it polluted all these plastic pellets into the water, and it was a huge disaster. Stopping the production of new sites. And then this is a map of the Louisiana hotspots, And the red spot there is where Cancer Alley is. And then it also shows here that that smaller red spot is where Sasol, which is the West African plant that started being built last year, is. But most of them are over here. And this is the organization, and it's called Rise St. James. You can find them on Facebook or at stopformosa.org. Stopping the production of new sites is not a big step. There are plenty of plastic producing facilities in the world, but it is unfortunately a very backward preliminary step. Freshly pumped oil is actually cheaper than recycled old plastics. Policies that promote a transition to salvaging recyclables and cutting down new oil production needs to be the way of the future. However, using recycled plastics should not be the end game. It must be a stopgap measure because all plastics pose a threat to the environment. Recycling is compromise, and recycling is a way to slowly dispose of plastic material. The other idea of alternative fibers for plastic pose many problems and should be considered with great scientific and historical evidence. Using them in foods has promise, but the way into the future must ultimately be about reducing use. Consumers must abstain and even protest or write letters to make it clear that plastic does not equate with sanitary. The coronavirus actually lives on plastic longer than it does on natural fibers. However, plastic lobbyists recently have pleaded with the Health and Human Services of the Federal Agency of the Health and Human Services to stop the plastic bag ban and even promote plastic as helpful in this crisis. This is pure propaganda, but it is working. This may, and when I say working, it's working at the federal level. They are actually taking away these plastic bans. This may require change in behavior, but change in behavior is what is needed to close the gap between what we say we want and what we really want. Right here and now, to join forces with Black Lives Matter and the people of St. James Parish would be a great way to start this movement. Demand change to Louisiana policy. Go to their Facebook and sign the petition. But of course, this is not only a Black Lives Matter issue. It disproportionately involves Indigenous Americans. The fact that the Keystone Pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline were allowed to be created has caused the 343 new petrochemical plants. These pipelines have been heavily protested by Indigenous action groups because of the effects they pose to these tribes directly. Poor rural communities were also impacted by these pipelines. This is a global humanitarian issue and an environmental issue because these processes are even more prevalent in other countries. It is also global because we feed on poor communities disproportionately to sell our garbage products. Greenpeace announced that Coca-Cola that Coca-Cola is not going to stop making plastic bottles because their customers still want them. This may be true, but it's not as true as the oil industry still needs them. And in our global community, we rely on them, on oil. So it's a vicious cycle. The time is ripe to create new policies that change global trade. Policies that change from neoliberalism to a more sustainable local economy. Policies that create barriers to trade, not to harm developing nations or level the playing field, but to slow excess trade that is obviously hurting the globe. Thank you.